Hey, in this video I'm going to show you how I put together a composition in a short period of time. This is all taking place in real time. So what I'm doing is I'm establishing a crosshair where my focal point will be. The horizontal line is known as the horizon line. The vertical line is where I want to put my focal point. That's where I want the viewer to actually look at the composition. So I'm starting out here with a quick underdrawing. It's a very loose sketch. Here I'm drawing a fence, and I'm keeping in mind perspective. When I sketch, I usually sketch fairly loose, so you can see that I'm putting together the horizontal and vertical beams of the fence. I'm using a pencil tool within Photoshop to draw this, and this is basically one of those old farm fences. Kind of, it's not perfect. It has irregularly cut wood. Putting a few grass tufts underneath. And then I'm going to tackle my focal point. I want to draw a barn. So utilizing references to draw a simplified version of a barn with a barn door that is open, little barrel of hay. So those elements are going to be in our midground. The fence is starting from the foreground and moving towards the midground. I'm also using a leading line in the form of a path that will take the viewer to the focal point. So leading lines allow the viewer to follow the lines to where you want them to look. You can use leading lines, you can also use color, and you can use large, medium, and small shapes to help get your viewer to the point of interest or the focal point. So I'm drawing some evergreen trees in the background behind the farm. Putting some planks. These are just guides for me when I'm getting ready to paint with shape. I draw through form, so you'll see that I drew that mountain through that fence. And I wanted to kind of maybe carry some of those trees past the fence. And now I'm defining the grain of the fence through lines. So this is just planning out the composition. I recommend going through a series of thumbnail explorations before embarking on the final composition. I thought the right side of the composition could use a little bit of something, so I decided to throw in some rocks. Again, this whole sketch is very, very loose. Making a new layer underneath, and this is where I'm turning on my screen, my keyboard casting, so that way you can see the keyboard shortcuts that I'm actually using here. So I'm labeling the layer, I'm calling it paint, and I'll start in with a base color first. So I'm going to pull up my swatches. I'm going to start off with kind of an orange value. And now I'm going to use the rectangular selection tool. I'm selecting the base color layer, jumping it to its own layer, and then dialing in a value of green. And I'm trying to make sure that the color value of green is not going to be just as bright as the orange. Now I'm establishing through the regular lasso tool, establishing the mountain. I wanted to go for something that's more of a bluish value. And I'm just adding a few bits that I missed and subtracting a few bits just to kind of maintain the shape of the mountain. Here I'm using the polygon lasso tool because it's a fence, and the fence is comprised of largely straight lines. So I'm just doing all the vertical beams right now. I'll eventually fill that in with brown. I'm making sure that that layer is above the grass layer. So everything that I'm creating is going to be on its own separate layer. Now I'm doing the horizontal posts, keeping in mind that those wooden planks, those posts, I guess, taper as we get further and further away from the viewer. These are really neat things to practice when you're painting with shape. And again, the idea behind this is to encourage folks that might be struggling with painting to have at least a few options to at least get started. So here I've got the front, the top posts all done. Now I'm blocking out the pathway, going back to the grass layer. I'm going to jump that selection to its own layer and then dial in a lighter value. Now I'm selecting the trees. I kind of zoomed out a little bit on this. I'm using the regular lasso tool. And I'm on the mountain layer. I'm duplicating the mountain layer by hitting Command J. Now we'll tackle the barn. The barn is going to be 2 shades of red. And I'm already now thinking about potential light sources. So the back end of the barn here is going to be a little bit darker. This is the metal, I'll be doing the metal top of the barn here in a minute. There's a repetitive series of keyboard shortcuts that I'm using. Command J jumps to a new layer, takes a selection, jumps to its new layer, or duplicates a layer, and Shift Command N will make a brand new layer. Command U will bring up the hue saturation, which allows me to quickly dial the correct colors without having to make repeated trips back to the swatches palette. I use the pen tool to make the top of the barn because it had some curved edges to it. So if you want some precision in your selection, use the pen tool and then convert that path to a selection. And we'll talk more about that in an upcoming video using the pen tool. Here I'm using the regular lasso tool to make both rocks, picking different values for the rocks. And now I'm ready to hide the layer that contains the pencils. I think I have enough information to go off of to actually begin adding some texture work to all the components here. So I'm just doing a little bit of cleanup on some of those background trees. Kind of tightening up the roof of that barn. Now I'm adding the panels that comprise the steel on the top of the barn. Adding some detail to the front of the barn. Adding the actual wooden slats. Painting with the lasso tool is super quick, and I know that this is not making a photographic accurate rendering, but the whole intent here is that even with elements that are photographically rendered, I think there's still a place for using the lasso tool to go ahead and do so. So now I'm repositioning the barn, just to kind of make sure that it lines up with the path. Scaling it up a little bit. The hay that I have is very close to the background, so I'm lightening it up a little bit. Now I'm adding a shadow component, making the back end of the hay dark. I just did a grayscale test there just to kind of check the values, because the hay was kind of blending in with the mountain, so I wanted to kind of push that a little bit more. You want to think about having a broad tonal value, which means a lot of variety between light to dark colors. And it's sometimes difficult to see that when you're painting in color, so I always have to do a value check while I'm painting. So I've mapped a keyboard shortcut to quickly check grayscale values within Photoshop, so I don't have to merge layers or do anything else like that. Now I'm just cleaning up the roof. I'm going to move the roof layer above the barn. And I'm just going to kind of scale it and adjust it. So that looks okay. Now I'm going to add a little bit of shadow on the underside of the roof, just to give some separation between the top of the roof. So this is kind of, I didn't really make any edits to this video. This is just seeing how I actually work. Now I'm playing with contrast and the positioning of the vertical fence posts, adding some grass elements, and I'm putting those on its own layer so that I can control it better. So you can see that the grass is kind of covering the bottom of the fence posts. So really you're trying to think about layers, and things that are on the top layer are going to obscure things that are on the layers below it, and that is a very important strategy to consider when you're painting or when you're doing anything in Photoshop. I'm adding the wood grain. I've covered that in a previous video. So here you can see the wood grain is done by holding down the shift key and using the regular lasso tool, and then jumping that selection to its own layer, and then adjusting its color through Command U. Now I'm going in and adding some definition to the mountains, you know, maybe giving a little bit of a sense of form, adding some light values in. Now I'm defining the path. I have to see the grayscale. That allowed me to change the color of the pathway because it was kind of blending in. I'll add some grass in front of the rocks. You want to think about overlap. Overlap is really, really important. Overlap is where you have one object in front of the other object. So I did a quick save, cleaning up the shape of the mountain, getting rid of some irregularities. I'm just thinking about what I want to do next. I want to add a shadow component, so I'm going to have the light source coming from stage left. And so I'm putting a shadow not only underneath, but it will cast over towards the left-hand side. So you can see the beam there. Shadows add depth. And here I'm just trying to think about what I want to do next. So I'm going to add the fence posts, kind of making a triangular shape. You know, I'm not making the shadows realistic. I'm making the shadows somewhat believable. Yes, there's going to be certain liberties that I'm taking with the shadows here, but it needs to generally match the shape that you're going in. So there's some shadows around the rocks. I'm switching to the polylasso tool to define the shadow on the barn. And these are all going to be on the grass layer. Now the sky needs to be changed. It's a little bit too orange. I want to make it a little bit light. I'll add a few more ridges to the road. Those will also serve as leading lines as well as adding texture to the road. There I'm adding just a few little straps to kind of give a little bit more insight into what this hay barrel actually is. Doing a value check. And now I'm going to add some shadows for those trees in the background. I'm selecting just the right half of those evergreen trees. And again, I'm holding down the Shift key to add to my selection. Shift will add to your selection. Holding down the Option key or the Alt key will subtract from your selection. So here I'm going back and just kind of filling in that tree with some more shadow. That helps give that tree some more definition. I'm doing the same thing for the other ones. I'm going to use a soft white brush and I will paint the back just to kind of give it a little bit more pop. I'm adjusting the grass. Looking for the grass that corresponds to the fence post. I'm cleaning it up a little bit. I find it much easier to talk about what I'm doing after I've already recorded myself working. It's a little bit distracting for me to talk while I'm doing it, and some of my videos have had that, but I just wanted to come up with something that's a little bit more manageable for me so I can focus on making the work and then kind kind of doing a play-by-play after the fact. So I'm doing another grayscale test just to check the values. And I realize that there's a lot of mid-tone values, a lot of medium grays, but not a lot of dark values. The only dark value that we really have in this composition is that barn door, right? So that has something that's super duper dark. I added some light values behind the mountain just to give it some areas of white. So what I'm doing here is I'm duplicating a layer for the vertical fence posts and setting it to multiply just to kind of darken the fence to give it more contrast from, say, the trees that are in the background in the mountains. And then I'm adjusting the color of the wood grain to kind of match. So now you can see that there's a little bit more of a broader tonal range within the piece. Now I'm considering the shadows on the rocks. Now I'm adding a little bit of overlap in the form of grass that is actually going to cover a portion of the pathway. And before too long I'm going to repeat that process for the grass, you know, giving the ground some texture, because right now the ground just looks like this big green area. Here I'm coming back in and just adding a little bit of variation on the blue, lightening it up on the left hand side. And I'm going with the soft round brush, and now I'm adjusting the highlights that are on the mountain. So here I'm going to switch to the regular lasso tool. I'm going to add just a few blades of grass, making very quick loops, very thin loops using the regular lasso tool. And I'll do that on both sides, just again to give some texture. You don't have to draw every blade of grass, you just have to show that there is some grass on the ground. I'm always sampling from my base color layer and hitting Command J. So now I'm moving the grass to the topmost layer, doing a value check. Now I'm setting a screen effect layer using my soft round pressure opacity brush. I want to add some atmosphere to the painting. So by painting with a soft round brush and using a saturated red, which is what I'm about to do right now, it just gives the scene a little bit more warmth, and you get that sense of sunlight actually hitting parts of the scene. You want to do it in a very subtle way. This is, by the way, a standard brush that comes with Photoshop. It's called the soft round pressure opacity brush. There you go. Well, I hope you found this video to be useful. Please let me know in the comments below. As always, I hope you learned something, and thanks for watching.